Hey everyone, it's Sevy. After all the anticipation, Kafka is finally playable and ready to dominate as the damage over time queen. This guide will cover her kit, traces, Eidolons, best relic and light cone builds, team synergies, and gameplay tips to help her step all over your enemies, as if they wouldn't enjoy it. And before we begin, you can check out my guide on damage over time or dot mechanics if you haven't yet, since that tackles a lot of the core principles of Kafka's particular niche. This video assumes that you're already familiar with the basics of dot, so you can watch that video afterwards if you need to clarify anything. With that, let's dive in.
Hi, Astral Expressors. Well, you caught me.
Kafka is a 5-star lightning nihility that introduces a new approach in playing dot teams through her detonation mechanics. Her perfect synergy with dot units will let her value and appeal continuously grow as more and stronger dot units appear in the future. To understand how she works, let's go through her kit and traces first. Kafka's skill deals lightning damage to one target enemy and lower blast damage to adjacent enemies. But most importantly, any dot effect present only on the main target will instantly detonate to deal a portion of its original damage. Normally, dots will count down its duration when they trigger on the enemy's turn. However, Kafka's skill bypasses that to deal their damage immediately while not consuming the duration or stacks of those dots. This is how Kafka front-loads what is supposedly damage over time, thereby solving one drawback of such teams and enhancing the potential of dot units. Next, Kafka's ultimate costs 120 energy. Casting it deals lightning damage to all enemies and has a 100% base chance to apply her own shock dot for 2 turns with an impressively high base multiplier, the highest single multiplier of her entire kit, in fact. Combined with her Ascension 2 ability, Kafka's ultimate will also detonate her own shock dot and any other dots applied on the enemies, just like her skill's mechanic. So ideally, you want to use her ultimate when your allies' dots are primed on the enemies already. You'll also notice that her ultimate's dot detonation scaling is higher than the skill's multiplier. That means higher dot damage output on top of being an AoE attack that detonates all enemies. For her talent, Kafka launches a follow-up attack when an ally uses their basic attack on a target enemy. This follow-up attack also has a 100% base chance to apply the same shock as her ultimate. You're bound to trigger Kafka's follow-ups naturally through your team rotation through SP generating allies. While this can only be triggered once every turn refresh of Kafka, it's still a great source for single target damage, a way to maintain her shock application, and a means of generating extra energy. As for Kafka's technique, she initiates battle to instantly deal lightning damage with a 100% base chance to apply the same shock as her ultimate. Use this if you want to get a head start on her dot application and breaking lightning weak enemies. Then let's quickly go through Ascension bonus abilities and stat bonus traces. As stated before, her Ascension 2 ability makes her ultimate instantly trigger both her own shock dot and any other dots that were applied on the enemy. This is valuable since her ultimate now gains the same utility as her skill in front-loading dots. Her Ascension 4 ability lets her regenerate 5 energy whenever an enemy with shock is defeated. This doesn't necessarily have to come from her own shock, as any other teammate applied shock will count. And lastly, the Ascension 6 ability gives a huge 30% base chance increase to her ult, technique, and follow-ups shock application. This is a huge improvement as it greatly reduces the effect hit rate target for her shock application, which gives her more stat flexibility. I'll discuss this more in the relic section. For the minor stat bonus traces, she gets EHR and attack, which are all important for her application and damage, and some HP for survivability. Combined with her A6 ability, the total EHR she gets from here already fulfills so much of her EHR needs, making it much less necessary to roll EHR substats on her relics. And for Trace's priority, her ultimate and skill are the most important, followed by her talent. Her basic attack won't be used much, so save your materials for more important things. Unlock all her bonus abilities and traces as they come along. If you want to review what her abilities can and can't do, here's a summary table for reference. You can also see that if we add up her multipliers, triggering her own shock dot comprises a larger portion of her damage sources, more so if you have her signature light cone equipped, which adds another dot effect. And regarding her skill point usage and rotation, Kafka's going to be a very skill point hungry unit since you want her to skill every turn to detonate dots and generate more energy. By default, Kafka assumes a 3-turn ult rotation, assuming that she can also trigger the follow-up attack every turn. Achieving a 2-turn ult rotation will be difficult. Even with a maxed ERR rope, that's not enough to guarantee 2 turns, so she would need a lot more other sources of energy to make this realistically possible. But a 3-turn rotation is perfectly fine and needs no extra sources of energy to consistently achieve. Now let's see what her musical jargon Eidolons add. Of course, these are not necessary, as E0 is already very much enough. E1 makes her follow-up attack have a 100% base chance to increase any dot damage the target receives by 30%. It's also considered a vulnerability debuff, so it'll stack with other vulnerability effects too. This clearly gains the most value on dot teams as it amplifies everyone's dots. E2 lets Kafka give a team-wide 25% damage bonus to dots just by being on the field. And I guess that's just Kafka's power, where everyone suddenly wants to start impressing mommy. Like her E1, the value of this increases the more dots you can apply on the enemy. E3 increases her skill and basic attack levels. E4 makes Kafka regenerate 2 energy whenever an enemy takes damage from her own shock application, whether by taking their turn or being detonated. This needs to be combined with other high energy sources or a high level ERR rope to enable a 2-turn ult recharge time. E5 increases her ultimate and talent levels. And finally, her E6 gives a huge 156% base damage multiplier increase on the shock she applies, while also extending its duration by 1 turn. This basically puts her own shock into overdrive. If you're ready to worship Kafka with the money burn, or in this case shock, her E1 and E2 are decent pulls and promise more potential with future dot units. Thankfully, you'll get a lot of value from also pulling Eidolons of her banner's 4-star dot units. Moving on, we have Kafka's relic stats and set recommendations. Let's start with some important notes about Kafka's stat preferences. Your top priority stats are speed and attack. Hitting higher speed breakpoints results in faster turn cycling. This also means that Kafka can do more dot detonations and faster follow-up attack refreshes, while attack percent boosts both her normal shock dots and raw lightning damage. Another question, since dots can't crit, is which is better to focus on, crit or attack stats? If you had to choose, then 9.9 times out of 10 attack will indeed be better. But that doesn't mean crit is bad, and in some cases, a crit build Kafka is surprisingly close to an attack build. Why is that? Generally speaking, attack has more value because it affects both her dot and non-dots, and we know that dots compose a large source of her damage output, although she still has relatively high normal damage multipliers. If you compare an attack body versus a crit rate body, and assuming you've invested in a decent crit ratio, the crit build is generally about 6 to 8% worse than an attack build. This can change though depending on the buffs applied. With Asta's high attack buff, this actually closes the gap to about 2 to 3% due to the diminishing returns. If you apply enough attack and damage buffs with other supports, it's possible for a crit rate body to become practically equal, or in rarer cases, very slightly overtake attack. However, with her early Eidolons or Sampo's dot focus debuff, they will once again skew the results in favor of attack. So if attack is just that universally better, then prioritize it instead. Farming it is easier, and you can also reserve your good crit rate pieces for other units that'll benefit a lot more. Crit substat rolls are of course always welcome, but min-maxing her crit like a traditional DPS is not something worth stressing over unless you're that devoted to having a nice stat page to look at. As for Break Effect, it's a situational stat that has great potential if utilized correctly, particularly since she can also detonate break dots. However, you have to plan carefully for Kafka to reliably break the enemy. This is also a playstyle where you'd likely want Serval as her teammate, since Serval can extend shock dots on enemies. So in theory, you can break with Kafka once and make Serval extend Kafka's break shock indefinitely. So Break Effect substats are welcome, and if you know how to maximize her breaks, then Break Effect will be more potent. I'd personally still prioritize attack though, which is generally more consistent and convenient to utilize. Her EHR target also significantly changes when you get her Ascension 6 ability. Before that, her shock sits at 100% base chance, so you want about 44 to 67% for a very reliable application. But with A6, her shock base chance goes up to 130%, so her EHR targets become 10 to 28% to gain a 100% real chance against enemies with 30% and 40% effect resistance respectively. Conveniently, much of this is already covered by her bonus stat trace's 18% EHR. However, she may still have other applications like the dot from her signature light cone or her E1, which only sit at 100% base chance, in which case that results in a 76% real chance against the same boss enemies. It's still pretty high, but if you go beyond 28% to increase that chance, just know that you're overcapping on her shock chance already. With those in mind, let's go through her main relic stats. For her body piece, go for attack percent as a general best option. If you want a crit Kafka build and are willing to go crazy min-maxing her crit stats, then you're looking for a crit rate body.
Then for her feat piece, you really want speed for hitting high breakpoints and allowing her to detonate more frequently.
For her planar sphere, use lightning damage. Lightning damage will buffer normal damage and dots, but attack is an okay temporary alternative. Then for link rope, you'll mainly want attack percent. Break effect is a very niche choice with potentially inconsistent results, so I would only recommend it if you have a solid breaking strategy with Kafka. As for her substats, prioritize getting attack and speed. As discussed before, break effect and crit rate are optional if you want to absolutely min-max and invest more in her damage output. If you want to prevent CC debuffs, effect resistance can be welcome too, since your team's damage output suffers a lot if Kafka gets disabled. With her stat bonuses and A6 unlocked, EHR rolls aren't really needed anymore for her shock reliability. As for her relic sets, the standard recommendations are the 4-piece Sizzling Thunder set, 4-piece Musketeer, or 2-piece combos of Sizzling Thunder, attack, or speed. 4-piece versus 2-piece combos are close enough in terms of stat bonuses, so it'll mostly boil down to which pieces have the right main stats and better substats. For the planar set, the Space Healing Station is the general top option for its large attack bonus to boost both her dot and non-dot attacks. An alternative set is the Fleet of the Ageless, which is in the same cavern. While it leads to lower personal damage due to a lower attack buff, it buffs the entire team, which helps boost the damage of your other units to balance it out. This also stacks even with multiple users in the team. One more very situational choice is the Talia set for its break effect bonuses, but again, be aware of the considerations of trading break effect for attack. You'd have to be very strategic of Kafka breaking to make good use of this. If not, attack will be more consistent. The speed requirement is also very high, so if you can't hit it yet, this is less recommended. Now let's go through Kafka's light cone recommendations. Your free-to-play 4-star option, and already a very good default one, is Fermata, which you can get and easily superimpose from the Forgotten Hall shop. It gives a universal damage bonus if the enemy has shock or wind shear, which is very easy to maintain, and the break effect is pretty nice if you're utilizing a break playstyle. Also, the art. The next option with high potential is Good Night and Sleep Well. It gives a stacking universal damage boost for every debuff applied on the enemy, maxing at 3 stacks. At S1, it's very close to an S5 Fermata, but it gets noticeably better with superimpositions. Eventually, it becomes a top choice at high or max superimposition and even closely competes against her signature light cone. If you have In the Name of the World, it's a good option with high 5-star base stats and decent damage boost. However, note that the EHR and the attack bonus only applies during her skill attack. The attack bonus is helpful, but the EHR does nothing for her shock application since her skill does not apply a dot. Still, it's a good stat stick, but generally at par with the previous options and overtaken by a high superimposed Goodnight light cone. Finally, Patience Is All You Need is her signature and overall best in slot with a couple of effects. It gives a universal damage bonus, a fairly high stacking speed bonus, and it allows Kafka the chance to apply Erode on enemies, which is basically a separate shock type dot on enemies to add to her detonations. Erode lasts for only 1 turn, but the chance to apply is per hit, which Kafka can easily reapply from her multi-hit attacks. All in all, amazing contributions to her kit. Also, the art. Finally, let's talk about Kafka's team comps. I've already talked a fair amount about general team synergies in my previous sample guide. In order to avoid those same points here, you can just check out the video later. Instead, I'll just focus on discussing Kafka's particular synergies in more detail. A large part of Kafka's potential clearly lies in synergizing with capable teammates, and teammates who can help amplify dots as well. As such, Kafka's standard team template will consist of at least one other teammate and a survival unit. The 4th flex slot can consist of a Harmony or Nihility teammate to apply relevant buffs or debuffs, another unit for a triple team, or another survival unit for maximum comfort. Sampo is an incredible teammate. He applies a stacking wind shear effect with a bouncing skill that's great for breaking wind-weak enemies. More importantly, he can inflict a vulnerability debuff against all enemies, which makes her dots and Kafka's detonations even more deadly. Sampo's niche can finally shine with Kafka's arrival, and he's a worthwhile unit to invest in for more team building options. Serval is another very synergistic unit. She applies shock and deals a pretty good amount of damage in AoE scenarios, resulting in very fast lightning breaking when combined with Kafka. It's a deadly combo versus lightning weak enemies. A special interaction between them is that Serval's ultimate can extend shock effects applied by any teammate. Kafka can easily maintain her own normal shock dot without Serval, but break dots are harder to consistently maintain, so Serval's extension mechanics can be specifically used to more easily maintain Kafka's and or Serval's break shock. Then the newcomer Luca is our physical and and debuffer. He's somewhat special since we finally have a unit that can apply a normal bleed dot rather than just relying on break bleeds. More so, his ultimate inflicts a universal vulnerability debuff which affects both dot and non-dot sources, which can have better universal use compared to Sampo's exclusive dot debuff. Luca's abilities are purely single target though, so he's most effective in such combat scenarios. There are units with dot application but aren't the major focus of their kit, like Himiko and Hook. They'll still rely a lot on their raw fire damage, but they can be useful particularly for breaking fire weak enemies, and you can tweak their builds a bit to make their break burn stronger. If you also want to optimize your break damage, be mindful of who's doing the most breaking and applying break dots in your team. Since Kafka can also trigger break dots, she has the opportunity to milk that, and you can specifically make your units to have stronger breaking capabilities. Whichever dot units you comp with Kafka, it's important to remember that a good portion of your team's damage comes from them as well. Kafka's detonations will only be as strong as the dots of her other teammates, so don't forget to give them enough investment too. And for now, it's a waiting game to see what new dot units will come and how strong they will be over other 4-star options. Kafka's our first 5-star dot-centric unit, so there's a lot of room to increase the potential of such teams when the 5-star versions of wind, physical, and fire dot units eventually drop. We'll just have to wait and see. You may also want to note some interactions that crowd control debuffs have with the dot playstyle. Entanglement and imprisonment debuffs delay enemies' turns, which delay when they get their dot, but at least with Kafka, since she front-loads dots already, delaying enemy turns won't be as great of a loss. Though, if you have the opportunity to apply a strong break dot instead, that will likely end up being a better route. Meanwhile, when you inflict frozen on the enemy, that requires them to take a turn to thaw first, and then their next turn gets advanced by 50%. This means that their turn rate will speed up, so they will take any dots, but also consume the duration sooner. Depending on the situation, that might be helpful or detrimental to you. Basically, you'll want to be aware if you're including ice, imaginary, or quantum teammates in case they break enemies and or inflict their CC debuffs. If you also want to use Kafka as a hypercarry unit without her fellow dot units, that's certainly viable too. This will consist of using a combination of 2 Harmony and or Nihility units that will focus on amplifying Kafka's damage a lot and a survival unit. Hopefully, though, this won't steal other hypercarry supports from your second team in Memory of Chaos that could make better use of them. While Kafka's not detonating other ally dots, Kafka still has her own shock to take advantage of, and depending on what units and investment level you have, such teams can do enough damage to beat even hard content anyway. If you really want to see the highest numbers on her, or maybe you don't want to build those other dot units, this playstyle is perfectly fine as well. And that's it for this Kafka guide. Let me know in the comments what you think of her, especially if you finally got mommy to come home. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!
Oh, bye-bye. See if you can surprise me next time.